Adam Schiff walked onto the House floor, expecting to completely humiliate Speaker Mike Johnson, but blindly stepped into the most devastating constitutional trap imaginable instead. What the senator from California didn't know what he should have known, because he spent 4 years across the aisle from this man, was that Mike Johnson wasn't just a speaker who inherited a broken caucus and held it together with duct tape and prayer. He was the constitutional lawyer who sat on the other side of the impeachment table. He was the defense attorney who read every page of every exhibit Schiff presented to the American people as evidence. He watched Schiff's performance, not from a television screen, not from a cable news panel, not from Twitter, but from 6 feet away, with a legal pad and a highlighter and a copy of the Federal Rules of Evidence that he'd been studying since he was 23 years old at LSU Law. And now, the man who performed impeachment was standing in the well of the House, looking up at the man who defended against it. And the man who defended against it was holding the gavel. Schiff didn't know what was coming, but he should have. Before we get into what happened next, if this is the kind of content that makes your pulse race, go ahead and hit subscribe. We are just getting started. The Government Reform and Accountability Act had been on the House floor for 6 hours. It was a Tuesday in late February, one of those Washington days where the marble hallways felt colder inside than the weather outside, and the chamber had that particular quality of light, flat, institutional unforgiving that made every wrinkle and every bead of sweat visible from the gallery. Speaker Mike Johnson sat in the Speaker's chair, slightly elevated above the well of the House, as he had for hundreds of hours since the most improbable speakership in modern American history began. He wore a navy suit, white shirt, no pocket square. His tie was burgundy. His reading glasses sat on the bridge of his nose, and he was reviewing amendments on a tablet occasionally, making notes in the margins of a printed copy with a blue pen. He looked as he always looked, like a man who had been accidentally promoted to a job too big for him until you watched him work it. The irony of Mike Johnson was that he looked ordinary. He looked like the guy at your church who volunteered to run the soundboard. He looked like the father who showed up to every soccer game 20 minutes early with a folding chair and a thermos of coffee. He looked like the kind of man you damn ask to notarize something because he just seemed trustworthy, and that was the problem for anyone who underestimated him. Because underneath the Sunday school manners and the soft Louisiana accent was a constitutional lawyer who had argued before state Supreme Courts, a man who had built his career at Alliance Defending Freedom, taking cases nobody else wanted. A first-generation college graduate whose father, a firefighter in Bossier City, had been permanently disabled in a fire when Mike was 12 years old. He watched his father nearly perish, watched his mother work 2 jobs, watched everything his family had built get reduced to hospital bills and disability checks, and he never raised his voice about any of it. That was the thing people missed about Johnson. He didn't do volume. He didn't do theater. He did precision. Quiet, constitutional, devastating precision. Senator Adam Schiff rose from the Democratic side of the chamber. He had been seated for most of the afternoon, whispering to staff, scrolling his phone, occasionally shaking his head at something a Republican colleague said during debate. But now he stood adjusted, his jacket walked to the well of the House, the lowest point in the chamber, directly below the Speaker's chair, and requested recognition to speak. Johnson looked up from his tablet, adjusted his glasses, nodded. The gentleman from California is recognized. What happened next would be replayed 14 million times before midnight. Schiff didn't start with the bill. He didn't even mention the Government Reform Act. He planted his feet in the well, looked up at Johnson in the Speaker's chair, and went straight for the throat. Mr. Speaker, Schiff began his voice, carrying that particular quality, smooth, rehearsed camera ready that had made him the most televised member of Congress for 3 straight years. I rise not to debate this bill, but to address the fundamental crisis of leadership in this chamber. A murmur rippled through the Republican side. On the Democratic side, a few members leaned forward. Schiff's staff, seated behind the rail, held their phones at angles that suggested they had been told to record. This was not spontaneous. This was a performance that had been rehearsed, timed, and coordinated. The attack filmed from 3 angles before the first word was finished. Speaker Johnson Schiff continued, his eyes fixed on the chair above him. "You are the most dangerous man in Washington." He paused. Let it land, let the cameras adjust, let the C-SPAN operators switch to the split screen that showed both the accuser and the accused. Not because you are powerful, but because you are weak. Johnson's pen stopped moving. He did not look up. His hand remained on the tablet, frozen mid-notation, like a man who had heard a sound in the distance and was deciding whether it warranted attention. You don't lead the House. Donald Trump leads it through you. You are a rubber stamp with a Bible and a gavel. You helped overturn an election. You signed an amicus brief, trying to invalidate millions of legally cast votes in states you don't represent in elections you had no jurisdiction over. Schiff's voice was building now, finding the rhythm that had made him a cable news fixture, the cadence that had carried him through 423 documented television appearances during the Russia investigation alone. It was a specific kind of rhetoric, not passionate, not fiery, but constructed, every clause building to the next, every pause calibrated. The performance of a man who had spent 2 decades learning exactly how long to hold a moment before releasing it. You are not a constitutional lawyer, Mr. Speaker. You are a constitutional arsonist hiding behind Sunday school manners. You dress up extremism in khakis and a kind smile, and that combination of radical ideology and cowardice empowers any MAGA loyalist screaming from the backbench. He pointed up at Johnson, an actual theatrical point, finger extended, arms straight. The gesture of a prosecutor in a television drama, which, in a sense, was exactly what Adam Schiff had always been. You are the man who is destroying this institution, and you are doing it so politely that half of America doesn't even notice. The Democratic side erupted in applause. A few members stood. Someone shouted, "Tell him, Adam." A junior representative from Connecticut brought her hands together in slow, deliberate claps. The applause of someone who wanted to be seen applauding. Johnson sat perfectly still. His pen was on the desk. His hands were folded. His reading glasses were still on his nose. He looked to the gallery above like a man waiting for a traffic light to change, like a man who had heard the weather forecast and was deciding whether to bring an umbrella, like a man who had been insulted before by people who mattered more and hit harder, and who had learned long ago that the only thing weaker than a weak man is a man who responds to every provocation as though it matters. The chamber waited. And then Mike Johnson did something he almost never did. He stood up. Johnson removed his reading glasses, folded them, set them on the desk beside the gavel. Then he leaned slightly toward the microphone. The chair will exercise its right of response. His voice was quiet. Not whisper quiet, functional quiet. The kind of quiet that made people stop talking to hear what came next. The galleries, which had been buzzing, went still. Senator Schiff, Johnson said. Thank you for that. A pause. I mean that sincerely. Because what you just did, standing in the well of this House, using the people's time, abandoning the people's business to deliver a personal attack on the chair, is exactly the behavior that makes what I am about to say necessary. He reached beneath the desk, and he pulled out a binder. It was not a new binder. It was not a prop. It was a 3-ring binder, navy blue, with a cracked spine and dog-eared pages. Sticky notes in yellow and pink protruding from every edge. Handwritten notes visible in the margins. It looked like it had been carried in a briefcase for years. I have been waiting to have this conversation with you, Johnson said. He held up the binder. Do you recognize this? Schiff's expression didn't change, but his hand, which had been gesturing freely during his speech, dropped to his side. This is my copy of the impeachment record, Johnson continued. First impeachment, United States versus Donald J. Trump. I was on the defense team, Senator, not as a commentator, not as a talking head on CNN, as a constitutional lawyer sitting in that chamber reading every exhibit, cross-referencing every claim you made. He opened the binder. The pages were dense with highlighting green, yellow, pink, and margin notes in small, neat handwriting. I sat across from you, Senator, 6 feet away for weeks. I watched you present evidence. I watched you describe phone calls. I watched you characterize documents. And I watched you do something that I have never in 20 years of legal practice seen another attorney do. Johnson looked up from the binder. You presented evidence you knew was incomplete, characterized it as comprehensive, and dared anyone to question you because you knew the classified material couldn't be released to contradict you in real time. The chamber was silent now, the kind of silence that meant everyone was listening not to see if he was right, but to see where this was going. Let me be specific, Johnson said. He flipped to a tabbed page. You appeared on national television 423 times during the Russia investigation. 423. That is not an estimate. That is a media monitoring count entered into the public record. He ran his finger down a page of notes. In those appearances you said, and I am quoting from transcripts, that you had seen evidence of collusion that was, quote, more than circumstantial. You said it was damning. You said it was significant. You used those words on CNN, MSNBC, CBS, CNBC 423 times, Senator. Johnson closed the page. And then Robert Mueller filed his report. No collusion. Then Inspector General Horowitz filed his report. Found 17 significant errors and omissions in the FISA applications your committee defended. Then Special Counsel Durham filed his report. Found that the FBI launched the investigation without proper basis. He set the binder down on the desk gently, like placing a Bible on a lectern. 3 independent investigations, Senator. 3. All of them. Conducted by career professionals, not partisans, not Trump appointees, career investigators. And all 3 of them contradicted what you told the American people 423 times. Schiff shifted his weight. His left hand found the podium in the well, gripping it lightly. His expression hadn't cracked. The man had spent a career controlling his face on camera, but something around the eyes had tightened. The look of a man who expected a Sunday school response and was getting a cross-examination instead. I was in that room, Senator Johnson said. I sat across from you, and I know not from television, not from Twitter, but from first-hand experience as opposing counsel, that the evidence you presented was incomplete, misleading, and in at least 2 instances characterized in a way that no responsible attorney would have characterized it. Johnson didn't pause for effect. He didn't wait for the murmur to swell and die. He simply turned a page. Let me move to the second article. Schiff's chief of staff, seated behind the rail, leaned forward and whispered something to a junior aide. The aide started typing on a phone. On September 26, 2019, you sat in this chamber in the Intelligence Committee hearing room, to be precise, and you read aloud what you described as the substance of the phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine. Johnson's voice remained level, no inflection, no sarcasm, the delivery of a man reading a legal brief. What you read was not the transcript. It was not a summary. It was not a paraphrase. It was a fabrication. You invented dialogue. You added words the president did not say. You created a version of that phone call designed to be as incriminating as possible, and you read it into the congressional record of the United States. He looked directly at Schiff. When you were confronted not by Republicans but by journalists, you called it a parody. A parody. Johnson paused, let the words sit. Senator, I am a constitutional lawyer. I have spent my career studying the documents that govern this nation. The congressional record is not a comedy club. It is the permanent record of the people's business. Every word entered into that record is preserved in the National Archives. Students read it, historians cite it, courts reference it. He leaned forward slightly. There is no parody exception to truth in official proceedings. The line landed like a gavel strike. On the Republican side, several members nodded. One clapped once, then stopped as if remembering where he was. You inserted fiction into the permanent record of the United States Congress, Johnson continued. And when you were caught, you didn't apologize. You didn't request a correction. You didn't ask the clerk to strike your remarks. You called it parody as though the congressional record is a Saturday Night Live script that you get to edit for laughs. Schiff's jaw tightened. He looked toward his staff. The aide was still typing. The chief of staff was on the phone, now cupping his hand over the receiver, whispering urgently. I want to be clear about what that means, Johnson said. Because this isn't a style point. This isn't a matter of political interpretation. The congressional record is a legal document. Federal courts cite it when interpreting legislative intent. When you fabricate content and enter it into that record, you don't just mislead the public. You contaminate the legal foundation that future courts will use to interpret the laws this body passes. Johnson tapped the binder. I noted it at the time. September 26, 2019. My note in the margin says, he read from the page. Schiff read fabricated transcript, called parody when caught. Congressional record compromised. He looked up. I wrote that 6 years ago, Senator. I have been carrying it since. Johnson set the binder aside. He placed both hands on the desk, leaning forward in the speaker's chair. The posture was new, not aggressive but deliberate, the posture of a man moving from argument to evidence. The third article concerns classified intelligence. The word classified changed the temperature. Members on both sides shifted. The gallery leaned in. In Washington, classified means someone might actually get hurt. Senator, you served as chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. In that role, you had access to the most sensitive intelligence the United States possesses. You sat in Schiffs, sensitive compartmented information facilities where material is discussed that cannot be shared outside those walls. Johnson paused, removed his glasses again, a deliberate gesture, the gesture of a man who wanted to look at someone without any barrier between them. I want the gallery to understand what a skiff is. It is not a metaphor. It is a physical room with no windows. Electronic devices are surrendered at the door. The walls are constructed to prevent signal leakage. Inside that room, intelligence officers, men and women who have spent careers building networks of human sources in hostile countries, brief members of Congress on information that, if disclosed, could result in the identification, capture, severe harm, and loss of the people who provided it. The word loss changed something. Members on both sides straightened. The gallery was motionless. The protocols aren't bureaucratic theater. They exist because a single unauthorized disclosure, one leaked detail, one name, one operational method, described in a newspaper article, can collapse an intelligence network that took a decade to build and put human beings in grave danger. I say this not as a politician. I say this as a man who has sat in those rooms as speaker and understood the weight of what I was hearing. Johnson put his glasses back on, opened the binder to a tabbed section, a different color tab than the previous articles. As Speaker 1 oversee the Intelligence Committee you once chaired, I have reviewed the access logs. I have reviewed the timing. And I have had staff compile a correlation analysis that I am going to describe to you now carefully, because some of the underlying material remains classified, but the metadata patterns do not. He ran his finger down a page. On 12 documented occasions, Senator, 12. There is a metadata correlation between Schiff briefings you attended and media reports that appeared within 24 to 48 hours containing information that could only have come from those briefings. Schiff's face went still, not a crack a freeze, the difference between composure and paralysis. His right hand, which had been resting on the podium, slid off the edge and disappeared to his side. Let me give you the structure of what the correlation looks like, Johnson continued. SCIF briefing on a Tuesday morning. You attend. You leave. Within 48 hours, a national media outlet publishes a story containing specific operational details, not general themes, not broad policy descriptions, specific details that match the content of that briefing. This pattern appears 12 times over a 26-month period. Johnson looked up. I am not making an accusation. I am a lawyer. I understand the difference between a pattern and proof. What I am telling you and telling this chamber is that the FBI's Counterintelligence Division has been provided with the full data set. They are conducting their own assessment. That assessment is ongoing. A murmur swept through the chamber, different from the earlier ones, sharper, the sound of people realizing this wasn't rhetoric, this was a referral. This was a sitting speaker announcing on the House floor that he had sent a counterintelligence referral to the FBI about a sitting senator. Schiff's chief of staff stood up behind the rail, actually stood up. He was holding his phone with both hands, thumbs frozen over the screen. He looked like a man who had just watched his car roll off a cliff and was still holding the keys. What I will say, Johnson continued, his voice dropping half a register, is that the irony should not be lost on anyone in this chamber. The same man who spent 423 television appearances accusing others of being compromised by foreign intelligence. The same man who looked into cameras and told the American people that he had seen evidence of treason, that he had proof that the President of the United States was an agent of a foreign power. That man had access to the most sensitive intelligence in this nation. And that intelligence appeared in the press repeatedly, in patterns that the counterintelligence professionals I have consulted describe as he glanced at a note consistent with unauthorized disclosure. He closed the red tabbed section. You spent 3 years accusing a president of being compromised, Senator, while sitting on the most sensitive secrets this nation possesses, in a room with no windows, with protocols you apparently considered optional. Schiff's grip on the well podium tightened. His knuckles, visible from the gallery, had gone white. He opened his mouth. The instinct of a man who had talked his way out of everything for 20 years, and then closed it. Not a dramatic closing, a mechanical one. The jaw moved, the lips parted, and then the machinery simply failed. No words came out. Not because he chose silence, because the language center of a man who had lived by language had, for the first time in his public career, encountered a moment it could not process fast enough to respond. And that was the moment people in the gallery began to record. Johnson straightened. He removed a single sheet of paper from the binder. Not a page of notes, but what appeared to be a printed document. An FEC filing. "The fourth article is the most difficult for me personally," Johnson said, "because it involves a matter of conscience." His voice changed here. Not louder, softer. The voice of a man in a church, not a courtroom. The voice of a father explaining something painful to his children. "Senator, you received a campaign contribution of $2,700 from a man named Ed Buck. The name landed differently than the evidence. The evidence was Washington. This was human. Ed Buck was convicted of multiple federal charges, including distribution of illicit, dangerous substances, resulting in tragic loss. 2 men perished in his apartment. 2 human beings, G.L. Moore and Timothy Dean, lost their lives. Ed Buck was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Johnson held up the FEC filing. You received $2,700 from Ed Buck. That donation is a matter of public record. What is also a matter of public record is the timeline. The first loss in Ed Buck's apartment occurred in July 2017. The second loss occurred in January 2019. Your campaign held Ed Buck's donation through both of those tragedies. The chamber was completely silent. Not the political silence of anticipation, the human silence of discomfort, the silence of people who didn't want to hear what came next, but couldn't look away. "I am a man of faith," Senator Johnson said. "I believe in redemption. I believe people can change. I believe that we are all capable of mistakes, and that grace is available to everyone who seeks it." He set the FEC filing down, but he kept his hand on it, fingers resting on the paper, not pressing, just touching it. The way a man touches a photograph of someone who isn't coming back. But redemption requires acknowledgement. It requires the courage to say, "I was wrong. I should have returned that money. I should have spoken about those men. I should have put conscience above convenience." Johnson paused. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped. Not for dramatic effect, but the way a voice drops in a church when someone is saying something they actually mean. G.L. Moore was 26 years old. He kept a journal. In that journal he wrote about Ed Buck. He wrote about what was happening to him. And then he perished in Ed Buck's apartment. That was July 2017. The chamber was so quiet that the ventilation system was audible. The soft mechanical hum of air moving through a building that was built before air conditioning existed. Timothy Dean was 55 years old. He passed in the same apartment, January 2019. The same apartment, the same man. And between those 2 losses, between a 26-year-old writing in a journal about what was being done to him and a 55-year-old passing in the same location, your campaign held Ed Buck's money. Johnson looked at Schiff, not with anger, not with triumph, with something closer to sadness. The genuine, unperformable sadness of a man who had spent his life in churches where people talked about the least of these, and who understood that the least of these sometimes perished in apartments in West Hollywood, while politicians counted their donations. You have never acknowledged that you took money from a man who harmed 2 people. You have never spoken their names, G.L. Moore, Timothy Dean, in any public forum, not in a press release, not in a floor statement, not in any of your 423 television appearances. You held $2,700 while families buried their sons, and you said nothing. Schiff's eyes moved. Not to Johnson, to the gallery, to the cameras, to the exits. The calculation was visible, the instinct of a man looking for the escape route, the talking point, the reframe. His lips moved. The ghost of a response, forming something about how many politicians received donations, something about the impossibility of vetting every donor. But the words never became sound, because there is no talking point for lost men's names. There is no reframe for a journal. There is no pivot from a 26-year-old who wrote down what was happening to him before he perished in the apartment of your donor. I don't bring this up to score a political point, Johnson said. I bring it up because you stood in this well 5 minutes ago and questioned my moral authority. You called me dangerous. You called me a rubber stamp. You questioned my fitness to hold this gavel. He picked up the gavel, held it. Not raised, held across his palm like a carpenter holding a tool, like his father held a fire axe. Not as a weapon, but as the thing you carry, because someone might need you to use it. I hold this gavel with clean hands, Senator. Can you say the same about the money you held? Schiff was standing in the well, but he was no longer performing. His posture had changed. Shoulders drawn in slightly, weight shifted to his back foot. The stance of a man who wanted to be somewhere else. His chief of staff had stopped whispering and was now watching the chamber monitor with the expression of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. Johnson set the gavel back down, opened the binder one last time. The fifth and final article. He didn't need to look at his notes for this one. He had been in the chair when it happened. On June 21, 2023, this House voted 213 to 209 to censure you. The resolution charged you with misleading the American people regarding the nature and strength of evidence of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Johnson's voice was measured, almost clinical, the voice of a judge reading a sentence. I presided over that censure, Senator. I held this gavel while the resolution was read. I watched you stand in the well of this House, the same well you are standing in right now while the charges were read aloud. He paused, let the symmetry register, waited for it to land. Not with impatience, but with the patience of a man who understood that some truths need a moment to arrive. 213 of your colleagues voted to formally censure you. Let me be precise about what that means. Because the word censure gets thrown around in Washington like a parking ticket. It is not a parking ticket. It is the formal, institutional, bipartisan judgment of the people's representatives that a member of this body has violated the trust placed in them. It is entered into the permanent record. It follows you. It is the closest thing the House of Representatives has to a criminal conviction without criminal proceedings. Johnson looked at Schiff. 213 people, not cable news pundits who get paid to have opinions, not Twitter accounts with flag emojis, not political opponents in some distant election. 213 members of this body, the people who work with you, who sit beside you in committee, who ride the same elevators, who eat in the same dining room, looked at the evidence of your conduct and concluded that you had misled this nation. He tapped the binder. That vote is in the congressional record, the same congressional record you contaminated with your parody. And unlike your parody, Senator, that vote is real. It happened. It cannot be called satire. It cannot be recharacterized as humor. 213 people, including members of your own conference, who abstained rather than defend you, who walked out of the chamber rather than cast a vote either way, because they could not bring themselves to say you were innocent but lacked the courage to say you were guilty, looked at what you did and concluded that the American people had been misled. Johnson leaned back slightly. His voice softened, not weak, restrained. The voice of a man approaching the end of a closing argument who knows the jury has already decided. I remember that day, Senator. I remember it because I was new to the chair. I had been Speaker for less than a year. And I remember thinking as I watched the roll call 213 to 209 that this was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of institutional sadness. Because censuring a member of this body means something has gone wrong. It means the system had to correct itself because the individual would not self-correct. Schiff's hand was trembling. Not dramatically, not the television tremor of a man performing distress. A real tremor. The involuntary movement of a hand that had spent 20 years pointing at cameras, jabbing at evidence, gesturing with the practiced precision of a man who understood that hands communicate as much as words on television. And that hand was now shaking visibly in the flat light of the House chamber because it was being pointed at instead of pointing. He pulled it off the podium and placed it at his side. But the movement was too quick, too deliberate. He knew people were watching his hands. He pressed his palm flat against his thigh, trapping it. Today you are standing in the same spot, Johnson said. The same well, the same marble, the same chamber, and the charges are worse. Johnson stood for a long moment in silence. The chamber held its breath. Somewhere in the gallery a phone camera clicked, the only sound in a room built for noise. Then Johnson picked up the gavel. He held it in front of him, not raised, not threatening, the way a man holds a Bible before he reads from it. "Senator Schiff, you called me a rubber stamp. You said I don't lead. You said I am weak." His voice was steady, the voice of a man who had heard worse from his own caucus and survived. "Let me tell you something about this gavel." He turned it slightly in his hand. The wood caught the flat light of the chamber. This gavel was held by Sam Rayburn, who led the House through World War II and kept this institution functioning while the world was on fire. It was held by Tip O'Neill, who worked with Ronald Reagan, a man he disagreed with on nearly everything, to reform Social Security and save it for a generation. It was held by Nancy Pelosi, who wielded it like a sword and never apologized for the scars of the battle left on the blade. Johnson looked at the gavel. "I hold it differently. I hold it the way a judge holds it, not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. The responsibility to maintain order, to protect this institution, to ensure that the people's business is conducted honestly, to ensure that when a member of this body speaks what they say is true, or at the very least, that they believe it to be true." He set the gavel down on the desk gently. "You, Senator, are the reason this institution needs a gavel. Because without someone willing to hold the line, without someone willing to say the gentleman is out of order, people like you turn the House floor into a stage. You turn the congressional record into fiction. You turn intelligence briefings into press leaks. You turn campaign donations from convicted criminals into accounting entries that nobody asks about." Johnson straightened his tie, put his reading glasses back on, picked up the gavel one more time. "You have been out of order in this chamber for 7 years. You were out of order when you fabricated a presidential transcript and called it parody. You were out of order when you told 423 television audiences that you had evidence that 3 separate investigations said did not exist. You were out of order when you held money from a man who harmed 2 people and never spoke their names." He looked down at Schiff. The physical geometry was complete. Johnson above Schiff below, the chair above the well, the gavel above the man. "And you are out of order right now." Johnson brought the gavel down. One strike. Not theatrical, not dramatic. Measured, constitutional. The sound of wood on wood that had echoed in that chamber for 230 years. "The House will come to order." The chamber erupted, but not immediately. There was a beat. A full second of absolute silence. The kind of silence that only happens when an entire room is processing the same thought at the same time. And then the Republican side exploded. Not applause, something deeper. Members standing, some with their hands on their desks, some nodding, some pointing at Johnson with the kind of expression that said, "Finally." Schiff stood in the well. He did not speak. The man who had spent 20 years filling silence with words, who had turned language into a weapon, who had built an entire career on the understanding that silence is death on television, and that the man who speaks last controls narrative, stood in the well of the House of Representatives. Produced no sound. His mouth was slightly open. His eyes were fixed on the Speaker's chair. Not on Johnson exactly, but on the gavel. On the small wooden object that had just been brought down once with the force of a period at the end of a sentence, and that now sat on the desk like a closed book. His chief of staff was at the rail gesturing. Subtle at first. A hand wave below the sightline of the cameras. The kind of gesture staff learn in their first week on the Hill. Come back to our side." But Schiff didn't move. And the gestures became less subtle. A full beckoning motion. Then a step toward the aisle. Then the chief of staff stopping himself, because going onto the floor would create a second story, a second clip, a second humiliation. Schiff stood in the well and looked up at the Speaker's chair. The geometry of the House of Representatives, designed by architects, who understood that the Speaker must be elevated above the members, that authority flows downward, that the well is where you go to petition and the chair is where you go to preside, had never been more visible than in this moment. Johnson above Schiff below, the gavel between them. For the first time in his public life, Adam Schiff had no words. Not because he was choosing silence as a strategy, not because his lawyers had advised him to stop talking, not because he was calculating the best response for the cameras, because there was nothing left to say. Every weapon he had ever wielded, eloquence, indignation, moral authority, The invocation of higher principles had been dismantled article by article with his own record. You cannot argue against your own FEC filings. You cannot cross-examine your own censure vote. You cannot object to a transcript of your own televised statements. The House came to order, and Adam Schiff, the man who always had something to say, walked back to his seat without saying it. The clip hit the internet at 4:47 p.m. Eastern, posted simultaneously by 3 different congressional press accounts and at least a dozen members' personal accounts. By 5:15 the House will come to order was trending on every platform. By 6 o'clock the full 12-minute exchange had been viewed 8 million times on X alone. Cable news split, the way cable news always splits. Fox led with Speaker drops the gavel. Johnson eviscerates Schiff on House floor. MSNBC ran, Johnson weaponizes Speaker's chair in political attack. CNN notably played the full clip without interruption twice. And Jake Tapper, who had hosted Schiff more times than any other anchor in cable news history, offered only, "That was something we haven't seen before." The constitutional law community responded fastest. Harvard's Lawrence Tribe posted a grudging acknowledgement that Johnson's characterization of the congressional record's legal significance was technically precise. Georgetown's Jonathan Turley called it the most effective use of institutional authority from the Speaker's chair since Pelosi tore up the State of the Union address. Except Johnson used words instead of paper, and he cited case law. Schiff's office released a statement at 7:30 p.m. It was 4 sentences long. It did not address the Ed Buck donations. It did not address the 12 metadata correlations. It described Johnson's remarks as a political stunt designed to distract from the radical Republican agenda. The statement did not mention the censure. It did not mention the parody transcript. It did not mention G. L. Moore or Timothy Dean. The statement was in its own way a confession, not of guilt of strategy. Because when a man with 20 years of media training and 423 television appearances to his name releases a 4-sentence response to a 12-minute floor attack, the brevity itself is the tell. It means the longer response was worse. It means the communications team drafted 5 versions, and each one opened a door they couldn't close. It means someone in that office said the words, "Every political operative dreads. There is nothing good to say." By 8 o'clock p.m., 3 separate Democratic strategists had appeared on background in Politico to say that Schiff had walked into a buzzsaw he should have seen coming. One unnamed senior Democrat was quoted as saying, "Adams' problem isn't that Johnson hit him. Adams' problem is that Johnson used Adams' own record as the bat. You can T-spin your own voting history." Another, a former leadership aide who had worked with Schiff during the first impeachment, was more blunt. He attacked the one guy in the building who had been in the room with him, the one guy who didn't need the binder who lived it. The FEC filing for Ed Buck resurfaced on social media by 9 o'clock p.m. By midnight, the names G. L. Moore and Timothy Dean were trending independently, not because of anything Johnson had done after the speech, but because millions of people were searching for them for the first time. The families of both men had been largely invisible in the political conversation for years, their grief overshadowed by the legal proceedings against Buck. Their sons' names reduced to footnotes in court documents. They were not invisible anymore. G. L. Moore's mother posted on social media for the first time in 2 years a photograph of her son as a child, no caption, no commentary. It was shared 400,000 times by morning. The FBI's Counterintelligence Division declined to comment on the metadata correlations, but 3 former intelligence officials appearing on different networks confirmed that the pattern Johnson described SCIF attendance correlated with subsequent media leaks was precisely the kind of analysis the Bureau would conduct in an unauthorized disclosure investigation. One former CIA officer speaking on CNN said simply, "If the data is accurate and the speaker seems confident, this is not a political problem for Senator Schiff. This is a legal one." Schiff canceled 2 scheduled media appearances the following day. His press secretary cited scheduling conflicts, but the Senate hallway cameras caught Schiff arriving at his office at 7:15 a.m., an hour earlier than usual, entering alone and closing the door. He did not emerge for scheduled votes until late afternoon. When he finally appeared on the Senate floor, he moved differently, quicker, head down, the gait of a man crossing an open field under fire. A junior senator from the Midwest tried to approach him near the cloakroom. Schiff walked past without acknowledgement. Johnson, for his part, did not do a victory lap. He held his regular Tuesday press conference, took questions about the Government Reform Act, and when asked about Schiff, said only, "I said what needed to be said. The House is back to work." A reporter pressed, "Mr. Speaker, do you think Senator Schiff should resign?" Johnson adjusted his glasses. The gesture was so habitual, so unconscious, that it had become a kind of signature. The pause that wasn't a pause. The movement that bought a half-second of thought while appearing completely natural. That is between Senator Schiff, his constituents, and his conscience. He picked up his binder, the same dog-eared, highlighted binder from 2019, tucked it under his arm the way his father used to tuck a logbook after a shift at the firehouse, and walked back to his office. In Bossier City, Louisiana, a man named Randy Thibodeau sat in a recliner in a living room that hadn't been redecorated since 1994. The television was tuned to Fox News. The volume was high. Randy's hearing wasn't what it used to be. Hadn't been since the accident at Station 4, the one that also took most of the feeling in his left hand and put his best friend Gary Johnson in the burn unit for 4 months. Gary Johnson, Mikey's father. Randy had known Mike Johnson since the boy was in diapers, had watched him grow up in a house where the bills came in red envelopes and the prayers came every night regardless, had watched him carry his father's firefighter helmet to school for show and tell in 3rd grade. The year after the fire, the year Gary came home with bandages on 60% of his body and a disability check that didn't cover half the mortgage, Randy watched the clip 3 times. The first time he watched it like a citizen, listening to the words, following the argument, nodding at the constitutional points he understood, and squinting at the ones he didn't. The second time he watched it like a friend, noticing the way Mikey held the gavel, the same way Gary held a wrench, steady and purposeful, no wasted movement. Noticing the way Mikey's voice stayed level, the same way Gary's voice stayed level when he was telling the new volunteers how to enter a burning building. Calm because panic harms. The third time he watched it like a man who understood what it cost. Because Randy knew something that the cameras didn't show, and the pundits didn't discuss, and the 14 million viewers would never know. He knew that Mike Johnson had learned quiet authority from a man who screamed once the ceiling beam came down, and then never raised his voice again. Not because he couldn't, because he understood that the loudest thing in any room is the man who doesn't need to shout. Randy picked up his phone. He didn't call Mike. The boy was busy, always busy. And besides, Randy wasn't the kind of man who called to say congratulations. He texted Gary, 3 words, "Your boy is good." 2 minutes later, Gary Johnson, 67 years old, retired, still wearing the compression sleeve on his left arm, still going to physical therapy twice a week, texted back. He held the line. Randy set his phone down, turned off the television, walked to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of sweet tea. The same way he had poured 1,000 glasses of sweet tea in this kitchen. The same way he would pour 1,000 more. Some men shout, some men whisper, and some men just do their job. Hold the thing they have been given and trust that steady hands matter more than loud voices. Mikey Johnson never shouted. Not when his daddy was in the hospital. Not when his mama was working double shifts. Not when his party couldn't agree on a speaker, and he became the last man standing in a room full of men who wanted the job more than he did. Not today. He just held the gavel and he brought it down. At LSU Law School in Baton Rouge, Professor Catherine Morrow was halfway through her Tuesday afternoon constitutional law seminar when her teaching assistant's phone buzzed. Then another student's phone buzzed. Then 3 more. Professor Morrow paused mid-sentence. She had been explaining Marbury versus Madison for the 43rd time in her career, and she was frankly grateful for the interruption, and looked at the class. Someone want to tell me what is more important than judicial review? A second-year student in the 3rd row, DeAndre Williams, who had argued the winning side in last year's moot court competition and who planned to clerk for the 5th Circuit, held up his phone. Professor, Speaker Johnson just cited the congressional record's legal standing in a floor argument against Senator Schiff. He is calling it a contamination of the legislative record. He is using Chevron framework language. Professor Morrow walked to the podium computer. She was 58 years old and had been teaching constitutional law at LSU since before Mike Johnson graduated. She had in fact taught Mike Johnson con law 2 spring semester 1998. He had been a quiet student who sat in the fourth row, took meticulous notes, and asked precisely 2 questions per class, both of which were better than anything she could have scripted. She pulled up the clip. 12 minutes. She played it from the beginning. The class was silent. When it ended, Professor Morrow turned off the screen and looked at the room. That, she said, is what a constitutional argument looks like, not on paper, not in a moot court, not in a law review article that 6 people read. In practice, on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, from someone who believes every word of the document he is citing. She paused. Speaker Johnson was in this room. He sat. She pointed right about there. 4th row. He was not the loudest student. He was not the most impressive on paper. He was the most prepared. Every single day. DeAndre Williams raised his hand. Professor, the congressional record argument. Is he right? Can fabricated testimony entered into the record actually contaminate legislative intent analysis? Professor Morrow smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had given a student question in weeks. That, Mr. Williams, is your final exam question. I will expect 15 pages by Friday. The class groaned. DeAndre grinned. And in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in a law school that would never be confused with Harvard or Yale or Stanford, a room full of future lawyers learned something that no casebook could teach them, that the Constitution isn't just a document you study. It is a document you carry, in a dog-eared binder, with notes in the margins for 6 years, waiting for the moment when someone needs to hear what it actually says. Mike Johnson carried it, and when the time came, he opened it.